Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. My name is Mohamed Bouabdallah, Cultural Counselor of France in the United States and Director of Villa Albertine. I'm very pleased to welcome you, and you are so numerous. Thank you very much for that. For the second edition of the Heritage Speaks series. As you may know, Villa Albertine and the World Monuments Fund, shared by my dear friend Bénédicte de Montlore, have decided to launch this series to shed light on threats faced by heritage sites and to demonstrate that solutions are within our reach if we do mobilize. In this regard, tonight's event is truly special. We all remember where we were on that tragic night of April 15, 2019. Myself, I was in Cairo as Cultural Counselor of France in Egypt. That very night, I was nearby the pyramids that have been there for more than 4,500 years. Looking at the news, looking at the pyramids, stunned, distressed, anguished. I remember those words of Paul Valéry. We know now that civilizations are mortal. Because Notre-Dame has been part of the landscape of every Parisian, every Frenchman, even every person that would dream or come to France for so many years. Because Notre-Dame was a character, and what character, of this mesmerizing novel by Victor Hugo that so many of us read in our youth. Because Notre-Dame was more than a cathedral. It was a place where the French Republic and the French people would gather to grieve or to celebrate. Because all of that, Notre-Dame was family. It was part of us. And we felt helpless. But we were not alone. As French poet Edmond Rostand said, it is during the night that it's beautiful to believe in light. This conference tonight will be about this: hope, belief, and solidarity. We will address the reconstruction of Notre-Dame de Paris, the largest project of this kind in this century, that will lead to its reopening on December 8 this year. We will address the extraordinary ability and resourcefulness of men and women when it comes to rising from the ashes. And we will address the tremendous generosity and empathy shown all over the world, and especially by the American people. Many American citizens reach out to us to share our grief and to offer their generous support. And I want to thank them once again in the name of the French government and the French people. Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce our speakers tonight. We have this special privilege to welcoming Édouard Philippe, Mayor of Le Havre and former Prime Minister of France. As the Prime Minister, Édouard Philippe was truly on the front line that very evening, and we are honored to have him here tonight to say a few words. Then Barry Bergdoll, professor at Columbia University. He will present an opening lecture on Notre-Dame. Then a panel discussion will address the reconstruction of Notre-Dame, and I am pleased to present our panelists, Rima Abdul Malak, former Minister of Culture of France. Rima was was Cultural Counselor to President Macron, and she played a key role in the reconstruction. She also has a special bond to Villa Albertine because she served here as cultural attaché, and we are very happy to have her with us tonight. She will be joined by Séverine Lepape, Director of Musée de Cluny, Joseph Pfeifer, First Deputy Commissioner of the New York City Fire Department, Lindsay S, Architectural Historian at Penn State University, and Matteo Pellegrino, carpenter at the Atelier Perrault, the company which restored the roof of Notre-Dame. And the Atelier Perrault have graciously agreed to lend us a model of the cathedral's framework. Thank you for that. Before turning the floor over to our speakers, I would like to thank the teams of Villa Albertine and of the World Monuments Fund for organizing this event. Thank you very much to all of you. I wish you all a beautiful evening, and please welcome Bénédicte de Montlore, President and CEO of the World Monuments Fund. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mohamed, and welcome everyone. It's always a great pleasure to be here, surrounded by friends. I was a former cultural counselor here, so I always feel like it's coming back home. And today it's really special because it's our Paul Mellon Lecture. So once a year we hold a lecture to focus and highlight a very special topic. And this year we thought that there was no better topic than the reconstruction of Notre-Dame. Today we are almost 5 years, day for day, after this fire. And as Mohamed said, we all remember where we were that day. And so we thought it was very important to highlight it because it was exceptional on many, many fronts. Mohamed has highlighted a few, but I think for us at World Monuments Fund, our mission is to safeguard heritage. And what we see every day is that very often people take heritage for granted. It's all around us. But the moment that Notre-Dame was on fire, everybody realized how much they cared, that heritage needs to be preserved, that heritage needs to be safeguarded, and how important it is for every community in the world. It's not the heritage of France or the heritage of Peru or Africa, where I was recently. It's the heritage of all of us. And this was also the impact of the silver lining of the fire at Notre-Dame. It was also striking to see the mobilization. At that time, here at the embassy, we organized concerts all over the United States in 10 cathedrals, and thousands of people came to show their solidarity to France and the importance they were giving to Notre-Dame. And that was really extraordinary to witness, both the mobilization in France and in the United States. And today, I can see this cooperation illustrated in all our projects. And this is something we're trying to foster and encourage day after day. Unfortunately, the fire that we saw this week at the Old Stock Exchange in Copenhagen illustrate very well that despite Notre-Dame, there are many, many lessons to be learned from those fires. Fire is still and remains one of the main threats to heritage. A lot can be done. Last year, we organized at Chantilly, and I see Chris Marion is a great fire expert who was with us along with 500 firefighters and heritage specialists in the Écurie de Chantilly, in the stables, to learn and share the lessons of the fire of Notre-Dame and of the Cathedral of Chartres. A lot can be done, very small measures can be taken to prevent this kind of fires, and this is what we're going also to talk about today. So I'm so glad to welcome all these friends. I was just talking to all the speakers. Most of them, our friends, are cooperating with our organization one way or another for this lecture because it's not only about Notre-Dame. Notre-Dame on a large scale is the biggest restoration project in the century, but there we are experimenting many things that we can replicate or that we are facing at smaller scale restoration project. How authentic does it need to be? What materials to use? So it's so extraordinary to hear that about Notre-Dame today. Before I conclude, I want to take a moment to recognize the late Suzel Kohlberg, who was an architect and has supported World Monuments Fund for more than 25 years and was one of our beloved trustees. We are recognizing her today because she was deeply passionate about heritage preservation and about France in particular. The last trip I took with her was, in fact, in Paris. 2 years ago, she was with us in France and showed all her passion. We are deeply saddened by her passing this summer and remember her fondly tonight, and are extraordinarily grateful. I want to thank her daughter, who is here, along with the rest of the family, for an extraordinary endowment gift that will allow WMF to pursue the mission that she cared so much about. So thank you for that. So on this, I want to thank all of you for coming tonight, and many thanks to our partners at Villa Albertine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bénédicte, and please welcome Mr. Edouard Philippe.
Madame la Ministre, Mesdames et Messieurs, as Maurice Chevalier used to say to my great-grandmother, there is no such thing as too much French accent. So trust me, you're going to have your share of French accent. On that day, on the 15th of April 2019, I was there. I was just in front of the cathedral. And I was, like everyone, at the same time speechless and sad. I was also worried. But when you're prime minister, you're always worried. Yeah. But I was speechless, which is not that often, and sad. Because what was burning just in front of me was a priceless legacy of our history. It was the testimony to the boldness and talent of the first builders who built a masterpiece. It was the history of France, of its king, the coronation of Napoleon I. It was the masterpiece of Victor Hugo, the poems of Claudel, the works of Viollet-le-Duc. It was also the sound of freedom on August the 25th, 1944, when the bell rang throughout Paris to celebrate the liberation. It was the face of millions of believers from all over the world who had made Notre-Dame a place of recollection and wonder. It was everything that I said, but it was also a part of my personal history growing up in smoke. Because when I was a child, my father, who was not a Catholic, who was not a believer, but who loved churches, used to take me to Notre-Dame. And me as a little child and him, we would go up in the towers of Notre-Dame, and I would look at Paris, and I would discover Paris. I was not raised in Paris, I was raised in Normandy, which is the most beautiful region in France. And and when I went to Paris, you know, I had to go to the church, to Notre-Dame, and I would discover Paris from Notre-Dame. And I would discover what it is when man, what it is when man tries to achieve something, when he has the ambition to reach for the absolute and for the eternal. And so it was also a souvenir of my father, who's dead now. And I think what I experienced, what I felt at that moment, that is the mixing of universal history and personal history, was something that was deeply felt everywhere around the world. Because somehow a lot of people have something to do with Paris. And when they have something, when they feel something about Paris, they have something to do and to feel with the cathedral. So we watched the fire, we watched the firefighters, and we were absolutely amazed by what they did, by the risks they took, and by the success they achieved. And just after the fire was over, I went in the cathedral. 1 hour after the fire was over, I went in the cathedral. And I just told you a few words about this, because the cathedral was dark. There was obviously water everywhere. But the light went into the cathedral by the outside. And the only thing that was shining when we entered the cathedral, I was with the French president, was the cross at the end of the cathedral. There was only one light, and miraculously, strangely, whatever, it was on the cross. And you have also melted lead, plomb? Thank you, Madame la Ministre. Melted lead that was, falling from not from the sky, but from the roof. It was the strangest view ever. It was beautiful. It was powerful. And we were, once again, totally speechless. Just after that, the president said to everyone here that the cathedral would be rebuilt. And the day after, he said that publicly that the cathedral would be rebuilt within the 5 years to come. This announcement was met with a very French skepticism, I must say. We're doing that very well. But we succeeded. And at the beginning of December this year, the cathedral will be reopened, will be rebuilt. And I know what is the first thing I will do after its reopening. I will take my 3 kids. I would go up the tower, if I'm allowed to, and I will show them what I never did and what I discovered with my father, what can men do when they think that they can reach for absolute and for eternal. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Prime Minister, for this testimony. Finally, please allow me to introduce our keynote speaker. Tonight, we have the pleasure of hearing from Barry Bergdoll. Barry is a Mayer Shapiro Professor of Art History and Archaeology at Columbia University and a world-class specialist in the history of modern architecture. Between 2007 and 2014, you were Chief Curator of Architecture and Design at the Museum of Modern Art. You organize exhibitions at the Musée d'Orsay and so many other places, so you know Paris perfectly well. And you are currently co-curating an exhibition on Viollet-le-Duc, who changed the face of Notre-Dame forever, for the Bard Graduate Center, and that will be shown in September 2025. And we are looking forward to it. Barry, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's really daunting to be here, not only with such a large crowd, but also with so many people who were not watching it on television, but watching directly in front of the cathedral, entered in those first moments, and also with people who will join us in a moment on the stage who have been very, very actively involved in the absolutely heroic and extraordinary 5-year challenge, not as a Soviet plan, but actually as a plan for achieving something of great substance and world-renowned. I want to, where's the clicker going? Small screen for a very big story and a very big and a very monumental building, which we will all be able to experience again after the 8th of December this year. I want, and I'm going to speak very rapidly, I apologize, but I have a lot to tell you in a very short time, and I want to animate a conversation among the specialists who are united here this evening. But I think before we do, it is interesting to have at least a brief synopsis of the history of Notre-Dame before April 15th, 2019, what I'm calling Notre-Dame's 3 critical centuries, and I think the 21st is its 3rd. So in a sense, we're looking at a monument that is not only, as has already been said, the history of France, the history of Christianity in France, an international symbol, but I think also in relationship with the agenda of the World Monuments Fund, it is also a site that has been at the very center of the history of the rise of modern preservation theory and conservation. There's hardly another monument that is so important for the way we think about preserving heritage today. So it's not only that Bénédicte de Montlort is French, but it is also that Notre Dame is the site of really the definition of modern preservation by one of its chief theoreticians, who I'll introduce you to in a moment, Viollet-le-Duc, who corresponds to this 2nd great moment. And of course, the 3rd great moment is in the last 5 years. You see that time is getting compressed as we move along from almost 2 centuries of construction in the Middle Ages to about 20 years, that should be 1865 there, to 5 years now. So time is speeding up. Nor, I would say also, is the 2019, the first fire at Notre-Dame. There were earlier fires at Notre-Dame. There are fires at imperil cathedrals throughout the history of church construction. Nor was 2019 the first time that the cathedral risked falling down. In fact, Victor Hugo, writing his book, feared very much that the cathedral might indeed collapse. Such was its state in the 1840s. So I want to take us a little bit back to a history of a place that has had as much drama as it has had peacefulness. And of course, I think just to put us in the mood, this that I have thanks to Joseph will remind us of that horrible event. So just briefly, I want to at least set up a frame for you to understand what was at stake in the 19th century when the cathedral went under its first great comprehensive restoration. And we might say that in a way, the cathedral was under restoration, as is so often the case with buildings that catch on fire, when the fire occurred, and we now are in a period simultaneously of reconstruction and restoration. The screen is small, so I won't take you through the whole history of the building, but as much as we think of Notre-Dame as a building of absolutely enormous harmonious unity, it in fact was built with changes over even the time of its construction, and so it it posed the challenge in the 19th century when the idea of restoring it was first raised, rather than the idea of simply living with it, changing it, adapting it. The 19th century we're going to see is the moment when the idea that a monument has a historic entity, that it must itself be preserved in its architectural form. The building bears traces of changes of decision, changes of design, and events, perhaps even a fire. Most importantly for us, and I don't know if this is going to just see it, I'm going to walk across and screen. Just want to point out one key thing. I thought the screen would be larger, but if you can see just here, very important is along here, quite different from what we see today, is a change in the elevation of the design of the nave from a 4-part to a 3-part structure that took place during the extended period of medieval construction. And some have even hypothesized, although this is much debated, that that change might have been in the aftermath of a significant fire in the Middle Ages. So I just want you to be aware of that, because we're going to see it in the 19th century as a huge decision of what to preserve, what to change, and setting up the drama that we might say, and it's one that played us out again in the last 5 years, of whether the cathedral should be conserved to some ideal form of perfection, or whether it should tell its own story, whether it should actually account for the changes in time. In the 21st century will come the debate of whether the cathedral should also tell the story of the 21st century. And this is one of the things that we will return to in debating tonight. We should say that for many centuries after the Middle Ages, after the completion of the cathedral, the Gothic fell into disfavor. And although the church cathedral played an absolutely extraordinarily important role in the life of the monarchy and the life of the nation, you can see by this painting that records the interior of Notre-Dame in the late 17th century, or in the period of Louis XIV, that an enormous amount of work was done in the cathedral, as much to glorify the king's relationship to Catholicism, to Christianity, to the vow that was taken by Louis XIII to dedicate the kingdom to the Virgin, to Notre-Dame. But at the same time, an enormous amount of attention was paid to obscuring the vision of the Gothic architecture, with these huge paintings that hid much of the Gothic detailing, the sense that Gothic architecture was no longer the modern architecture of France, even if the building was venerated. And so when Louis XIV made good on the vow of Louis XIII for this dedication to Notre-Dame, tremendous changes take place in the apse, most significantly the creation of this great masterpiece of a sculptural group, the vow of Louis XIII, that we see there today, which miraculously survived the fire, even though it stood very near the crossing, receiving only some of the lead that was falling miraculously on the palm of the figure of Christ, but these artworks themselves preserved. So they do remind us that the church is also a palimpsest of its own history, of the changes that have been taking place there. Edouard Philippe already evoked another event in which Napoleon wanted to capitalize on what the deposed Bourbon kings had verified in the 18th century, 17th and 18th century, this connection by crowning himself emperor 2 years after the cathedral reopened, having served as a temple of reason under the Revolution, having been much desecrated and much removed in the 1780s and 1790s. And indeed, you can see Napoleon wanting to be present in Notre-Dame, but not necessarily present in Gothic architecture, since the apse was recast in a classical form, contemporary classical form to hide the Gothic architecture while he positioned the crown on his own head. All is going to change with the rise of Romanticism. The novel already evoked Victor Hugo, which we'll see in a slide in a moment. But we might say that once Viollet-le-Duc arrives on the scene, which he will in about 3 slides, Viollet-le-Duc has going to play between 2 possible positions. Should this cathedral, which had been in a Catholic sense, desecrated during the 1790s, made into, as I said, a temple of reason. Should it be repaired and restored so that it recounted all of the differences of its history? Those palimpsests were available in the forms of the building. One could read the history of France and the history of Gothic architecture in the very fabric of the building. Or should it be brought up to what was being celebrated by Romantic writers and sort, beginning with Chateaubriand in The Genius of Christianity, on to Victor Hugo and many other writers, and not only in France. I'm showing you here a juxtaposition of Viollet-le-Duc's idea of the ideal cathedral and a German painting of a completed Cologne cathedral, the idea arising of the Gothic cathedral as the perfect expression not only of Christianity, but of each national identity. The Germans claimed Gothic, the English claimed Gothic, the French claimed Gothic. The 1830s and 40s was the war for who would own Gothic. And Notre-Dame was the embodiment of the French claim that the Ile-de-France was the place where Gothic architecture had been born and perfected, and Notre-Dame was its perfect expression. But of course, Notre-Dame, we might evoke this also, the project, interestingly, in exactly the same moment, 1842, one of the predecessors of the many ministers of culture here decided that there would be a competition for the restoration of Notre-Dame, launched in 1842. We'll turn to that in a moment. In the same year, Prussia decided that the incomplete Cathedral of Cologne, which had sat in the state that you see for about 4 centuries, with a construction crane that had been stopped moving for the construction of the towers, arrested motion, if you will, was put back into motion within 40 years to complete Cologne Cathedral and to be able to celebrate its opening, not in 5 years, but in 40 years, as a symbol of a unified Germany. So we see how political the whole idea of the Gothic cathedral had become in the 19th century, when many were taken not only with Victor Hugo, who writes perhaps the first novel ever to have a building rather than a person as its chief character, but also publishes his famous tract, his famous manifesto, Guerre aux Démolisseurs, War on the Demolishers, against those who would desecrate or damage Notre-Dame, rather than, here we have engravings of it in the 19th century, almost all of its various crockets and florons had been removed, all protruding stone that might fall on the on passers-by had been taken off. Rather than repairing them, the building was slowly stripped of a lot of detail. Its crossing, the flesh, the crossing spire, which will be undoubtedly a subject during our debate, as it was in the immediate aftermath of 2019, had been taken down in the 1780s. There was a medieval spire, but it had disappeared. You see it missing in that view of about 1830. Happily for the story of the 19th century, there was a campaign of the brand new technology. Here's another theme for the rise of modern preservation, but also I think the work of the World Monuments Fund and others, the relationship to up-to-the-minute technology and the restoration of a historic monument. The brand new art of photography in the form of the daguerreotype documented the building just before construction, renovation and restoration by Viollet-le-Duc. So here we have on the screen an engraving which shows some remnants of one of the cathedrals that had actually predated the medieval cathedral, and on the right, in 1841, daguerreotype. If you can focus on the central door, that door that you're eager to go through on December 9th of this year, you will see that in the 18th century, the trumeau, the central post, so important to divide that door in two, but also for the statuary, had been removed in the 18th century by the architect Soufflot, who had wanted to make clearer passage for royal processions. Also, under the Revolution, all of the kings had been removed from the Gallery of Kings that divides just above the 3 portals there. A lot had changed. it was using these daguerreotypes too that Viollet-le-Duc would begin his work once he and the slightly older neo-Gothic architect Jean-Baptiste Lassus won the competition in 1842. You see one of the drawings from their entry there on the left. We hope we'll show it to you here in New York next year at the exhibition, but they declared in their lengthy report, which is still one of the great documents on the historical study of the building, that their aim was, as they say, to reestablish the cathedral in its ancient splendor. So this idea that in order to undertake modern work, we're going to get back to something that has been lost. So they win against two competitors this competition, and their aim, I would say, from the beginning, this is one of my favorite photographs of 19th century Paris. It shows Viollet-le-Duc's aim with the famous spire you just saw collapsing on April 15th. I think I would say to have his way with the 18th century architect Soufflot. Soufflot and Louis XV had changed the physiognomy of Paris with the great dome of the Pantheon, and Viollet-le-Duc is saying, Notre-Dame, the Gothic cathedral, can take its place back in the landscape of Paris. We are going to restore the fullness of its detail, but we are also going to give it a spire that can reign over the French capital. And so this is a photograph just after the completion in about 1867 of the spire. You also see what's going on, the construction of the central hospital, the Hôtel Dieu, and the idea, too, that if Notre-Dame is a great monument, it must have a frame of open space around it. So the preservation of Notre-Dame also is accompanied by the demolition of much of the Ile de la Cité in order to create a parvis, open space around what now should be admired, like a painting in a frame, a great monument in a frame of urban space. So let us very quickly move through Viollet-le-Duc and get to the stakes of what has arisen in the aftermath of the April 15th fire. Here is a photograph by the great French photographer Hippolyte Bayard, just after work has begun. If you look just to the right of the south transept, of course we're looking from the left bank at the cathedral, you see the beginning construction of the new sacristy in a complete neo-Gothic style that takes its form from the forms of Notre-Dame. So this idea that even additions will be cloned from a complete understanding of the building. And indeed, Viollet-le-Duc and Lassus, over the next decade and a half, after they win the competition, the work finally is financed and gets underway around 1844, are literally going to take much of the cathedral apart and put it back together. We hope to be showing you next year what are conserved miraculously in the rich archive of Viollet-le-Duc, these so-called attachments in which every single stone, so there we can see Viollet-le-Duc saying, it's a little bit bleached out in the image, this stone of the flying buttress can stay, this one needs to be replaced. So literally the building is taken apart and put back together in a certain way, its stones examined forensically, and a documentation taking place that also leads to the final definition of Viollet-le-Duc's understanding of Gothic architecture as a complete and rational system of vaulting space. And then he comes to one of these very interesting moments of decision. Is he going to restore the cathedral to an ideal vision, or is he going to restore it in such a way that it tells us in stone rather than words its own history? And the decision is made, as you can see, just here at the crossing. Each time we get to the crossing, I have to cross in front of you. This decision to restore the earlier four-partite elevation with breaking the rhythm of the third three-partite one there so that we can see the various stages. For Viollet-le-Duc believed that, in fact, the change had taken place after a very significant fire, a theory which is dismissed by the current architect, Philippe Villeneuve, who is leading the architectural work there. Now, an ideal cathedral should also be restored in Viollet-le-Duc's idea to the full richness of not only all the sculptural program, but the polychromy, the color that he thought had made the building into a absolutely splendid, colorific, emotionally resonant building in wall paintings, in fabrics, and of course, in stained glass. So much of the colored aspects of Notre-Dame's interior are Viollet-le-Duc's attempt to recreate what he firmly believed had been the coloristic effect and aesthetic of the Middle Ages. So you see there two views before the fire and a view of the cleaning that's now going on. much of this had been recovered in some of the chapels in the apse just before 2019, darkened again by the fire. So this is to get back to Viollet-le-Duc's notion, and I hope I'm introducing you to the fact that what was at stake in 2019 was the question of, are we restoring a medieval building, or are we restoring equally a great monument of 19th century Romantic architecture? We could, if Benedict had given me 3 hours for a seminar, compare the daguerreotypes before and after and see many of the decisions that Viollet-le-Duc had made. I'm only going to point out two here on these two images, before and after. At first they look almost identical, but when you start to pay attention, you see that these flying buttresses have been completely changed in form. We're on the south flank, as has the design of the top of the transept, the gable here. And a little bit harder to read is this slight rotation of the rose window, which was demounted and put back into place by Viollet-le-Duc, who was bothered by the fact that there was a void at the top rather than a structural strut. And so he rotated by about maybe 3 minutes, if you will, the window on the south transept. So the building is as much, many would say, and I'm a fan of Viollet-le-Duc, so this is not a polemic, the building is as much the work of Viollet-le-Duc, who saved the building from a possible, at the very worst, collapse, but at least from a slow decay that had been in work for decades. Another view of that, we wanted to continue the work of comparison. And just there to launch us into this thesis that I'm giving to you, that the Cathedral of Notre-Dame is also a place in which the modern science of building conservation and preservation came into existence. The definition in Viollet-le-Duc's 10-volume rational dictionary or complete dictionary, the Dictionnaire raisonné de l'architecture, where he gives the word restoration, noun, feminine. Both the word and the thing are modern. To restore an edifice means neither to maintain it, nor to repair it, nor to rebuild it. It means to reestablish it in a finished state which may, in fact, never have actually existed at any given time. It's a very paradoxical, but I think quite profound discussion he's having here. He says the idea that the construction of another age can actually be restored is an idea of our own century. And it is not clear that this kind of architectonic restoration has ever been clearly defined. No civilization and no people have ever carried out restorations in the sense in which we understand the term today. So we are witnessing at Notre-Dame and with Viollet-le-Duc the modern definition of this cultural value of restoration. Now, as he worked on the cathedral, he began to think that he knew it so well that he and the Gothic architects were speaking the same language, and therefore he could speak things that he assumed they would have said, even if he didn't always have absolute evidence for exactly how they said it. Now, the gargoyles, the monsters, the chimères, all of these had disappeared. They'd taken down progressively over the course of the 18th century. The whole, if you will, zoology of Notre-Dame is much loved. Postcards, probably as much of this as any other feature of the building, are the work of Viollet-le-Duc. And of course, most importantly for us, because we just saw it collapse in the fire of April 2019, is the whole issue of the spire. We know from this very precious painting, not only a beautiful painting, but an important document in the collection of the Musée Carnavalet, we know exactly what the spire that was on the building until shortly before the revolution looked like, juxtaposing it with a photograph of the beginnings of Viollet-le-Duc's work there in the 19th century, but he hasn't yet taken on the spire. The spire, we know, if you look to the left-hand drawing by Lassus and Viollet-le-Duc, was intended to be replaced at about the dimensions of the spire that had disappeared. But after Lassus died in 1857, work progressed. Viollet-le-Duc became more and more convinced that Notre-Dame deserved a much higher spire, and nearly double in height. And he designed, in a Gothic language, that until it fell, I think few wanted to disparage it as a 19th century monument rather than an integral part of this complex cathedral, this extraordinary spire. Itself a masterwork of carpentry, covered with lead and with the idea of having the apostles descending and ascending in the four corners of the crossing of the nave and the transept. And the only apostle that I want to call your attention to, and if you haven't been to the Cité de l'Architecture recently, the statues are there and you can go and look at them in the face, which you could not for all the time that they were up in the sky. The uppermost on one side is the figure of St. Thomas, the patron saint of architects, and it bears the face of Viollet-le-Duc, who is looking up to admire his work as the designer of the cathedral. So this is the place where Viollet-le-Duc signed his work. Now, happily for those of us who believe that Notre-Dame is as much a monument of the Middle Ages as it is of Romanticism in the 19th century and the rise of preservation theory, those statues had been removed weeks before the fire. So here we see them coming down, and of course they were off for safety and restoration, because as so often a fire takes place during a restoration, tragically. So I think most of these stories or images are well known to you now from the press and from the last couple of years. I want to just throw in some images. Chartres was mentioned. Notre-Dame is not the first cathedral to suffer fire, but the outcomes have been different at different times. So here's Chartres, which had a major fire in 1836, and the decision was made. You can see that beautiful watercolor from the 19th century of when the roof is missing over the vaults to the right. And the decision was made to rebuild the structure of the roof in iron, the new material of the 19th century. So we have a roof structure at Chartres, which you have all visited as a beloved Gothic cathedral, but did you know that it had, where you can't see it above the vaults, the largest span made by iron that had ever been achieved up until that point in 1836. And likewise, after the First World War, with the bombardments of the cathedral at Reims, and with the help again of enormous American funding through the Rockefellers, the roof of Reims Cathedral was rebuilt largely in concrete. So we have this issue of how to rebuild a lost major work of the technology of the Middle Ages when the roof burned and the spire collapsed through the vault of the crossing at Notre-Dame. And here I'm just going to give you, before we all take our place on stage and raise some of these issues, because of course, almost overnight the question was raised, what about Le Forêt? Do we rebuild it exactly as it was? Do we do something differently? Is 21st century technology going to offer an answer that could be different from the strenuous work that has been undertaken in the last 5 years of finding the timber and recreating the magic of the Forêt? I want to, of course, speak with experts on fire of whether the place can be the same given the needs of fire prevention. You probably were talking about that in Chantilly already last year. But there you can see, when you go in December, you will see vaults. It's almost impossible to tell where the vault has been rebuilt. And you will also see, Le Corbusier wrote a very famous book called When the Cathedrals Were White. When he wrote it, there were no white cathedrals except perhaps Sacré-Cœur, which isn't a cathedral. But when you go into Notre-Dame, you are going to enter into a building of a beigeish white now, of absolutely stunning beauty. And you're going to see Notre-Dame as you have never seen it in our lifetimes. So with the teams involved, with the architecte en chef Philippe de Villeneuve on this drawing, these renderings, everything in red is what has needed to be done. The effort has been enormous. It has cost nearly 800 million euros with huge outpourings, as we know, also of international support, partly through the Friends of Notre-Dame. It has involved nearly 250 companies and art workshops across France. Some 500 craftsmen are at work here on any given day, although when I visited, it seemed that they seemed to be more pressing into the thousands, not to count the number of people who were working in the temporary construction barracks behind the apse. Carpenters, stonemasons, scaffolders, gilders, glassmakers, organ builders, working on scaffolding, but also sometimes suspended like mountaineers on ropes. And the digital reconstruction project, which has brought some 50 billion data bits to create a digital equivalent of Notre-Dame. So we now actually have two Notre-Dames, a physical Notre-Dame and a virtual Notre-Dame. So just some images, and then we'll take our places up here to discuss what has been achieved, what have been the issues at stake, the work on the carpentry of stabilizing the building, which really was the major effort of the first year and a half or so, and then the beginning of the work of reconstructing, almost sometimes impossible to see the cathedral, for the second cathedral of scaffolding around it. You will all remember that President Macron, in the immediate aftermath, I think the embers were probably still warm, suggested that the 21st century could contribute something to the cathedral, that there might be a competition for redesigning the roof and the spire. For a moment, what we now see 5 years later was not a given. Many architects rushed. Some rushed, in my view, much too quickly. They were sort of ambulance chasers of restoration to suggest 21st century ideas that might be deployed. There are two of the many that appeared in the press and on Instagram. But I think one bit of emotion when miraculously the famous rooster, the coq, was actually found on the ground a few days after the fire. It seemed to signal the fact that along with the existence of the statues, that there was a place for rebuilding the spire as it had been, and perhaps the roof to go along with it. Philippe Villeneuve has redesigned the coq. You might wonder why the coq, the rooster, is a kind of symbol of resurrection and a symbol of hope, traditionally, particularly in France. But here, a newly designed rooster. So there is a 21st century overt transformation, a rooster evolving from the flames or resorting from the flames as a kind of rooster phoenix. And then we might just finish with, and I'm sure Matteo will be able to tell us much about the timber here, the extraordinary creation of the central spire part of the flesh, which has been raised in place. These are photos that came the other day from the chantier. There, we're back at the very end of last year with the completion of the spire, which was finally the new rooster put in place, I think, in early February of this year. So this brings us right up to date. And of course, this detail, which I got from Villeneuve the other day, of the final culmination of the spire, and we can see the face of Philippe Villeneuve looking down at the face of Viollet-le-Duc. But all is not resolved. At the moment, a controversy is again raging in France, along with skepticism that was evolved by Edouard Philippe. I think the French also love controversy. And so the current controversy is over the current desire of President Macron and apparently the Archbishop of Paris that some of the 19th century stained glass windows in the apse might be removed, even though they survived the fire, in order to make way for works of contemporary creation, that the desire that the 21st century should be part of the palimpsest of Notre-Dame, as it will be left to future generations. And so this is where things stand today. Again, a new controversy, and as a university professor, I will pass out now your examination books and say, discuss. Sit down on your microphone. I'm not going to reintroduce everyone. They were briefly introduced at the beginning, and you also, I hope, picked up this handsomely printed. It's just like when you're in church, you have the manual that tells you which hymn we're on. So you have a guide to the speakers, and I'd like to ask each of the speakers not only to respond to the question that I'm going to pose to you, to bring you into the conversation, almost like introducing various instruments in an orchestral concerto, but I want also for you to feel free to elaborate and to respond to what each one has said, so that we don't have to have 5 mini talks and then finally break into discussion. But I'd like to start, if I might, with you, Rima Malak, because you are one of those who was in the administration at the time, although I think you were in New York when you learned of this, no? Here, when you learned of this terrible fire raging in Paris. I wonder if you could, from your point of view, shed any light on the debates within the administration on the balance between recreating as precisely as possible what had been lost once it became clear that the cathedral itself was not going to be lost, and contemporary interventions. What were the possible scenarios and what were the arguments for and against? Or simply, what did you feel as a member of the administration at the moment when this beloved symbol of France for the entire world was imperiled?
Thank you. Yes, I mean, when the cathedral, the fire started, I mean, it was such an emotion worldwide, and it took a while before realizing that it was saved, actually, and it took a few days, but then a year and a half to stabilize and to make sure that the foundations were secured and that the restoration project could start. So in this phase, we were also in COVID times and with the pandemic, so yeah, a moment of anxiety worldwide too. And this symbol of the rebirth of Notre-Dame and the mobilization of all the workers and artisans and companies from all over France and from all over the world, actually. Some came from the US, some from Europe, was a symbol of the rebirth of the country globally after and during the pandemic. So there was really this parallel all the time in our mind. And concerning specifically the restoration project, you mentioned Philippe Villeneuve. He's the chief architect of the project and of Notre-Dame. He's the most specialist of Notre-Dame ever, I think. His project was presented to the Archbishop, to the President, to the City of Paris, to the Prime Minister. And it was important to listen first to his advices, and he's the expert. So he really pushed for the identical restoration, and many other architects did so. And so I think at one point the president listened to that, even if his first wish was maybe to have something to mark a new era. And this contemporary gesture, if it was the spire, would have been a very visible new mark of this new era. Like in 50 years, in 100 years, how will we know that a fire happened and that a restoration, a huge restoration happened? So because the cathedral, when it will reopen, it will be more beautiful than before and completely restored. The stone are more white than before. And so maybe in 100 years, the new generations, they won't know that a fire happened, except if they read in history books. So the idea was to have somewhere a trace, a mark of this change and of this rebirth as a positive way. But there was also a need of consensus, and the contemporary spire was not consensual at all. And even in the architect community, some of them, like Jean-Michel Villemotte, was in favor of the contemporary spire, but many others said that it didn't really make sense. If you do a contemporary spire, you need to change the whole roof. It has to be contemporary too. And if you change the roof, and then how about the foundation? Well, it was really, we got into the details and it seemed quite complex, and we don't want to delay the restoration. So there was this need of consensus, this need of not delaying the restoration. And in fact, the idea that maybe there were other ways to mark this new era. Other ways through, for instance, the rooster, you saw, the new rooster actually is a contemporary design, even if we don't really see it well because it's way up high. We will see it from the plane. The stained glass, that's another way. So now that's this controversy, but I think it's, well, there was already one in the 30s, I think, around the stained glass of Notre-Dame, so that's not new. And not all the windows will be concerned, only 6 of them, I guess. So it's a little contemporary touch in the cathedral. And the surroundings of Notre-Dame will be completely transformed because there was a contest, an architectural contest, landscape architect Basmet won, and he will start designing after the restoration project, starting in 2025, the surroundings. So it will be completely different, with more trees, more shadows, different circulation, different access to the cathedral. So this is also a contemporary way of getting to the cathedral. So after putting everything on the table, in July 2020, the president decided to let the chief architect present to the Heritage Committee his project as an identical restoration, and this is how it went.
Just one quick follow-up question, and maybe a little selfish because I'm curious to know myself. There were also many of the other buildings on the Ile de la Cité are in something of a state of transition. The opening up of the new Palais de Justice. There's been certain parts of the adjacent Hôtel Dieu, which we saw under construction in one of my photographs. And I know there was a discussion at one point that there might be a Musée Notre-Dame, a new museum in the Hôtel Dieu. Do we know anything about
Yes,
the
I forgot
state
to
of
mention that, but that's a big decision and big announcement that was made in December. So there will be a museum about Notre Dame in the Hôtel Dieu site. So it's the precise site has not been decided yet, but the project is being prepared by Charles Personnaz, who's the head of the Institut National du Patrimoine. So it's currently, he's consulting many people, and of course Cluny will be partnering with this museum because the collections of Cluny are related to Notre Dame history, of course, and other museums and universities, and so it will be. We can see, for instance, what the archaeological research has, what emerged from these research in Notre Dame. We will see the old rooster. We will see the stained glass that will be removed. Many other objects and documents. Yes.
There's so many ways we could go with this conversation, but I think we're going to stick with the drama of the fire and try to get it behind us. And then I want to turn to the actual construction. I hope we can learn more because we have this extraordinary model that gives us some insight at a smaller scale of what has been going on above the scaffolding and high to the sky. And then I want to turn paradoxically back to the past, because one thing that I did not mention, and we have two leading medievalists here from either side of the Atlantic, one thing that I did not mention is that the strange event of a fire so frequently opens up new lines of research about the past in an unexpected way. And so I want to ask what we might have learned about Notre Dame that we didn't know before it almost fell down. So that's a little bit the sequence of how I want to take this conversation. But I know that you, Joseph, were in contact not only with officials in Paris, but with your counterparts in fighting fires. And of course, you don't just fight fires, you think about how to prevent fires. So I wanted to ask you a little bit, if you could tell us about your own experience, but if you could give us also your thoughts, moving not only on reliving the emotions of those days, but what can be learned from the fire at Notre Dame.
Thank you. I feel privileged to be here with such scholars and experts in this field. But let me bring you back to that day, because I talked with General Gallet, who was the fire chief that day. Matter of fact, we were good friends since the attacks in Paris in 2015. When I went over to Paris to find out what happened, we became friends, and he's come back to New York. So let me tell you what you may not know about what he felt like that day, and also what the firefighters did. That day, as the firefighters went in, they knew that there were fire up in the attic area, and they were starting to go up to fight that. But they also knew that there was precious art. The crown of thorns, the tourniquet, special art. And they went in to save it. And as General Gallet said, firefighters went in, they came out, and they said, "Chief, we got it. We got the crown of thorns." And one of the curators was standing there next to General Gallet and said, sorry, that's the fake one. That was the one, that's the one on display. Now you have to go back in. And the spiral collapsed, yet they went back in, and they saved the real crown along with other precious relics. And I talked to the mayor Maria Hidalgo, and it was the most intense interview I ever did with anyone. I'm sitting in her office interviewing her, and she said, I could understand English, but do you mind if she speaks in French? And my French is not too good. And I'm sitting there, and I have Jules Naudet, the filmmaker, next to me, who can translate. So I asked her questions in English, and she spoke in French, and Jules translated. But what she said, this is a half hour of intense conversation where we never broke eye contact. You could feel the emotions as she described that day. But she's explained that the artwork, as they brought it out, they had to put it somewhere. And they brought it back to City Hall. And what she said, it was the first time in centuries where the religious and the secular came together. What a powerful statement. But back to the fire. As the fire was racing across the roof, they had a meeting with General Gallet, the Prime Minister, President Macron, Mayor Hidalgo, and others. And General Gallet said, this is dangerous. If the bells from the bell towers collapse, it will pull down the towers and the cathedral will be lost. And it's dangerous going in. If we don't succeed, the cathedral will be lost, and if we send our firefighters in, we'll be taking out, in his words, something like 20 coffins of firefighters. And he had to make a decision. And we knew each other, and we talked about what I did as being the first chief on 9/11, sending my firefighters into the North Tower to save 20,000 people. And the way he related to me was that he stood there, and what he thought, in his words, was to go or not to go. And he turned to the president and the prime minister and others and explained the danger. And he said, if we don't do it now, there'll be no chance to save the cathedral. And the president looked at him and allowed the general, the chief, to make a decision. And he said that we're going to send our firefighters in. And President Macron put his hand on his shoulders and said a few words, basically, good luck, be safe. And he sent the firefighters in. And the firefighters climbed the North Tower first. And then Mayor Hidalgo explains they had little flashlights on their helmets. And as they went up the tower, you could see the lights of the firefighters climbing this tower. And it was a sign of hope. And the firefighters were able to put out the fire and stop the fire from going across, even though the whole roof was lost. But the lesson for us is how do we preserve artwork? And Barry, given assignments as a Columbia professor, and I'm also a Columbia professor, so I have to give you assignments. And one of the first assignments, and I'm not sure if they did it, but a couple months after the Paris, the cathedral, the fire, I was in Paris having lunch with one of the architects. Now, in Paris, I've learned that besides having a wonderful lunch, you have to have a little wine. And I didn't want to have international problems. So we're sitting there, and I said, what we should do in these cathedrals and these monuments is that, as we did in St. Patrick's Cathedral, put mist sprinkler systems in there. That if it happens again, we can control it. We can mitigate the problems. Because we all want to say it'll never happen. So that's one thing to look at. The other thing, and I'm going to be very specific, because this is where Paris and New York comes together. And that's an art rescue. My experience with Paris and Versailles, they have a program that the curators work with the fire departments to say, take this piece of art out first. And this is how you carry it out. And it's to the point, I'm told, that there's a picture of Napoleon in a big frame, and is huge and weighs a ton. And just imagine telling firefighters, if you can't save the building, cut around the edges because you can't take out the frame, and then bring out the picture, bring out the painting. So what I challenge this group to do, and we can do it together, working with our colleagues in Paris, let's look at our museums. Let's look at our historical places that we can't replace what's in there. And let's work to identify, and we can put into a secure computer program what to take out and how to take it out. And that's what they've done in Paris, and we've had them come here speaking. But let's take something away from here, not just knowledge, but how do we save the precious artwork? And let's do this together.
May I add something just regarding fire prevention, because what you said is really important. What we decided to do after Notre-Dame's fire, because there was kind of a wake-up call, and we have 87 cathedrals in France, that the government has the responsibility for these 87 cathedrals. So I was the cultural advisor to the president at that time, and I convinced him to invest 80 million euros on a security plan for all these cathedrals. And prevention of fire, of course, but not only. And what we learned with the restoration project of Notre-Dame was actually being implemented in other cathedrals. So this sprinkling system you talked about, thermal cameras, I think we say, caméra thermique in French. So you detect the source of the fire, and before it starts, you can react. And also in the attic area, to compartment this attic area so that the fire, it takes more time to grow. This kind of things actually now are being implemented since 2-3 years in all the cathedrals in France, thanks to this security plan. This is very important to know, because most of the time we speak about Notre-Dame and we tend to forget that we have many other in Amiens, in Reims, etc. And so we are securizing these cathedrals too, and I hope it will work and we won't have any fire there. So that's a good lesson learned also from Notre-Dame.
That is great to hear, because about 1.5 years ago, I was in the roof of Sens Cathedral, which I think is one of the most important now, timber, very ancient timber, and I mean, it's sublime, the beauty of it, but you think it's got to be subdivided, at least with some type of material that could be taken away if needed for a photograph or whatever, but you looked at it in completely different way. After the Notre-Dame fire, you don't see those spaces in quite the same way. It does lead us, of course, to the interesting fact that this foyer has been rebuilt, and it is now nearly finished, and somebody who is often up there with the timbers and working, Matteo, who doesn't only work at Notre-Dame, but he works as a carpenter in timber in both new construction and restoration. And we're thrilled that you're here and that you brought the model that I hope many people got to see, one of the many models, itself made in oak, just standing out on the in the room that we came into this room into. So Matteo, you are a specialist in carpentry and in joinery. All the more important is the way these pieces go together, both for new buildings and for historic restoration projects, and a key craftsperson, as I mentioned, at Maison Perrault. Are the techniques used in the Middle Ages and on Notre-Dame restoration still coherent and meaningful today? Can you explain for us any differences between the approach taken in the roof structure and the spire? Is that the same? So well, are we looking at a absolute replica of medieval work? Are there key differences? How would you characterize what you're doing up there?
Thank you, Barry. So as you say, there are two different techniques used on the spire and on the medieval frames. That reflects the differences in construction back in the day. So we restored them to how they were as they burned. At the Maison Perrault, with myself, we worked on the medieval frames, so the choir, apse, and the nef. And indeed, we restored them to how they initially were in the Middle Ages. And it was a great honor to be able to work on these frames, especially from the very beginning to the very end. So from the forest to the roof. We were able to go back in the forest with templates, thanks to the hand drawings of the architects and all the plans, all the work that was done beforehand, and to find the trees with the same shapes, the same characteristics as they had back in the day. And I'm a firm believer in these techniques on a personal level and on how they still are coherent to this day. It's not folklore, it's not an imitation or sadness of the times that have gone by, but I think they're still very relevant to this day. So we're talking about greenwood carpentry. This is wood that has not seasoned. It's wood that we started felling in November 2022, and we raised the last beams just a year after. So it's techniques we're not very much used to these days, but clearly 800 years after, they were still standing. So, I mean, it speaks for itself. And so, great restoration project, sad, tragic event, but great for the artisanal way of working, the French know-how, and even international. As you were saying, I had the privilege of working with the Maison Perrault with two American friends.
Carpenters.
Yes, Peter Henriksen and Scott Carlson, great guys. And
in the rooster, we put a new, how do you say, a parchemin? Scroll. With the names of all the workers, all the artisans, all the people who contributed to the restoration. So these American names, your name, even my name, is on this paper.
do you know how long the scroll was?
No. You know?
No. So yeah, greenwood, I just wanted to finish on
I was
that.
going to ask you, and please, I'm not the only person that can ask questions here, so if Lindsay, Séverine, as medievalists, if you have questions for Matteo, but I was going to ask you to tell us more about green wood, so I'm not at all knowledgeable about carpentry, but I imagine that the wood is going to change over time and it's already been cut and put in place, so what is it like to work with green wood as opposed to working with timber that's been felled and prepared a long time in advance?
Great pleasure. No, so green wood is wood that has not seasoned yet. It's wood that's freshly been cut, so without going too far, there's still water in the fibers. And it's wood that will season later on. It's important to note that when we work with green wood, we must use techniques that are coherent and can adapt with green wood. So the techniques are adapted to the raw materials. And that's what we've done. I mean, once again, we didn't invent anything. These are techniques that have been proven by time. So the advantage of working with green wood is that it's a lot softer, easier to work. And since the frames were hand-hewn, they were worked by hand, it was the only the only raw material that would allow us to work in this manner. So we went to the woods with templates, with lists, thanks to the architect's work. We marked the trees as they were standing, and a second time as they were felled to be sure that the quality was up to standards. So two selection processes. And then they were shipped to the workshop where we hewed them by hand And the advantage of doing this, other than beautiful finish, is that it allows us to follow the grain of the wood, follow the natural shape of the tree. And this simply means that as it seasons, as it dries, it will not deform. It will not. Sometimes at the lumber yard we see beams that are a bit. So it's, technically speaking, it's very interesting. Time intensive, lots of labor, but great product. So we were able to find the similar finish and also the technical qualities of the frame.
I want to turn to, in my experience, medievalists always join together. So of course, Séverine Lepape and Lindsay Cook are over on my far right. You're both medievalists for whom Notre-Dame is inevitably a major monument of study. I think for you, Lindsay, it's been preoccupation for many years. In addition, Séverine Lepape, you are the director of the Musée de Cluny, which is itself, I think, a creation of the same cultural moment that of the restoration of Notre-Dame, and a kind of, in a certain sense, a long-standing partner of the work at Notre-Dame, partly because the Louvre did not want to collect medieval art in the 19th century, so the Cluny became a place for this, what was admired by a new group of people. But I wanted to ask both of you about what has been learned about the past through this. And maybe I'll start with you, Séverine, because I thought, of course, the loss of the forêt, of the carpentry roof, is a major loss of a monumental achievement of medieval architecture and medieval craft. But aside from what was lost and is in the process of being recreated, did any new insights or knowledge come out of the fire in the last 5 years of restoration, either in terms of insights into the churches that preceded the medieval cathedral? I've mentioned a few times that, of course, there were at least 4 or 5 smaller buildings about which not a great deal is known. Some people might know the archaeological crypt that has been there for many years. Or in terms of understanding aspects of the cathedral itself that have been lost over the centuries of repairs. I wanted, therefore, to expose you all to what had happened to the transformations of the East End and the apse, which are no longer in their medieval configuration at least since the 17th century. So I wondered what new things you have learned in the last 5 years, or if you've gotten answers to questions you've had for many years.
We don't have yet all the answers, but it's true, and it may be highly paradoxical, but it's really true that this terrific loss brought really unparalleled advances in the knowledge of the building. After the fire, lots of scientists joined their effort together to work and to try to find the answers to very important issues. And there was around different associations, such as the Association of the Scientifique de Notre-Dame, but also 200 scientists coming from very different fields, such as art historians, of course, archaeologists, but also physicists, chemists, engineers in structure, in digital, and they worked together and they formed a kind of group called the Chantier Scientifique de Notre-Dame, and you can find a very nice publication that was undertook under the supervision of Philippe Dillman, who was really the man who made this kind of coordination of all those scientists. And yes, it was a very big effort, and they decided to try to bring elements that could be very quickly used, for example, for the builders, for the architects, but also for the next generation, for the scholars. So, for example, what was the structure of the cathedral really damaged? To what degree the stones were altered because of the heat, because of the water? What can the wood that was remained could bring as answers for datations of the frame, for example, and we made very big advances in the knowledge of the datation now of the frame. You were talking about green woods. There was a kind of legend that all the big, very, very big piece of wood that were used to form the frame were coming from primaire forests, that it took 20 years to dry them, and it was also the opinion of Viollet-le-Duc. And all those researches proved that it was not the case, and there was in the medieval time using already green wood, and they would done with this and to make the wood living and to cut it and so on. So they made a very, very high and very big effort. The first aim was for them, because there was a laboratoire de recherche des monuments historiques, the Centre de recherche et de restauration des musées de France, of course, drag with the SRA and lots of people who were working with the idea, that they were working with Établissement Public de Restauration. But the first aim for them was to collect all the remains, and I don't know if you can figure out what was the figures, what was the amount of those remains and the nature, because it was really diverse. There were nails, there were a piece of burnt wood of the frame, there were keystone, there were elements of polychromy, there were metal staples, and they made a lot of pallets. We were talking about 650 pallets of stones, 350 pallets of metal, 10,000 elements of wood. So, and they wanted to collect them in a proper way, like a kind of archaeological way, in order to be sure that we could know where they were coming from. So it was really important, and it was a good, really, it brought a lot of new insight of how this frame was created, how it was achieved. Also with other issues that could be, for example, maybe more I would say unusual about the climate, the medieval climate, because the wood can bring elements to know what was the climate in the 12th or in the 13th century. So lots of aspects that will be again studied, because it's only the start. For this, all these elements. Another major discovery that was made during this tragedy was, of course, the discovery of the medieval jubé that you may have all heard about. Yes, maybe you have some. So in the crossroad of the transept, the architect needed to put a scaffolding, and in order to put the scaffolding, they had to dig the ground. So they discovered a radier, which is a kind of masonry platform, and under this radier, they discovered, very properly buried, 100 remains of what was the medieval jubé, or the medieval road screen, with so sculptures element of this road screen, with an unparalleled and breathtaking polychromy. This jubé was built during the 13th century, but it was demolished in the 18th century because of the new use of the liturgy, where Christians wanted to open up all the spaces, and everything was buried, and you can see this polychromy, which is really unique and gives you an idea of what could have been the original polychromy of the outside sculptures of Notre-Dame. It was, we know the iconography program, it was devoted to the Passion of Christ, so you can see elements of sculptures, of human sculptures, you can see microarchitecture, and there was also a big program to make this polychromy kept, because it's really fragile. And there was some element of this jubé who were discovered by Viollet-le-Duc, because he made some very small digs, excavation in some part, and then it went to the Louvre. And if you go and see, there are 3 or 4 pieces there that are completely white and washed. And you say, but why is it so white? But you can imagine, you can explain this very well, because the polychromy is so fragile that in a decade it can completely collapse. So there is a very big enjeu to keep this polychromy, and we are very happy that the Musée de Cluny would exhibit 20 or 30 elements of them in the exhibition that we will do during the fall of this year, because, as you said, yes, the Musée de Cluny kept a lot of the sculptures of Notre-Dame. We were created just on the same time as Viollet-le-Duc was working on the cathedral in 1843, and we were under the supervision of the Commission Nationale Supérieure des Monuments Historiques. So for an architect such as Viollet-le-Duc, if he had to remove original sculptures from the cathedral and he had to send it somewhere, it was to the Musée de Cluny, who had this role to preserve them. So we wanted really to join the general effort. So we made a 2 years campaign of restoration of our medieval sculptures of Notre-Dame, and we will present them in a very different way as we did, because we have a room dedicated to them, but we really want to do something new and to incorporate the element of the Jubé, which will be, of course, a very important part of the collection of the future Musée de Notre-Dame.
Lindsay, the last but not least, you are an American specialist of French Gothic architecture. I know you also worked with, trained at Columbia, as was the late Andrew Tallon, who I know you knew very well, who did these amazing scans of the cathedral that have played a role in the both understanding the building before the fire, but also in the work of reconstructing it. In a sense, I have the same question for you. What new things have you learned in the aftermath of the fire? But if I can be provocative, I also wonder, what are your attitudes towards preserving or recreating the work of Viollet-le-Duc as a medievalist? And to what extent, for you as a medievalist, is the whole enterprise we've been discussing tonight a work of medievalism or a 21st century contemporary work?
So I think the first thing that comes to mind, you've been making the case that this is a 19th century cathedral too. And I would say that for a medievalist, we've always seen it that way. And in fact, it's been frustrating in many occasions when you want and you hope that you might be looking at something that really comes from the 12th century or the 13th century. And oh no, when you really get to the site and you look at it, you realize, oh no, that was changed by Viollet-le-Duc. So I think it's always been there, ever present. I would say one thing that's come out of the fire is that, frankly, the cathedral is more of a medieval cathedral than medievalists ever realized before. So in that sense, we've regained a medieval cathedral that we really thought had been a 19th century one all along. The other thing, I don't know if there are images here that go along with what I'm going to say. Let's see. The other thing that really comes to mind, you mentioned the work of Andrew Tallon. Yes, this is it, exactly. I would say there are sort of two pieces of documentation that have been so valuable to the reconstruction, and this is something that's really been salient for me. On the one hand, we have the laser survey that was made of the cathedral, and you're seeing here actually not only the one laser survey I'm mentioning here made in 2010 by Andrew Tallon, but also a kind of composite laser survey that's put together by scientists subsequently through this project that Séverine was just talking about, the researchers that have been involved in this project. Having this level of detail means that the cathedral ultimately, even if it looks medieval in certain ways, because some elements have been made, again, based on this laser survey, it means it's the most 21st century of operations you could possibly imagine. There are certain elements, for example, Barry showed you the interior of the cathedral, which looks stark white, and also the vaults look just like new, but they also look just like they did in 2019. That's made possible by this scan. So the exact arches, which every single one is unique in the whole entire building, it was possible to recreate them exactly as they were, in many cases in new stone. So even though individual stones aren't necessarily replaced, it still is able to follow the exact shape of the original vaults. The other side of this, though, which is, I guess, really in a lot of ways goes back to the 19th century and the way that buildings were represented back then, is also the amazing work that Rémy Froment, in particular, and his colleague Cédric Trentezeau, so two architects, had done to conduct a hand-drawn survey as well of every single truss in the roof. And I would say this is the thing that led to Matteo being able to do what he was doing, right, to have this very, very very close level of detail and attention, especially to the particular joints that were used in these elements. And you're seeing here also what Séverine was alluding to, which is the level of detail that we're now able to see in terms of the dating and the reuse also of particular members here. So I would say that by having all of this information, we're in an age of information, by being able to apply that to the cathedral, it tells us that even if it looks medieval, it is one of the main symbols that, or signs rather, that it is a 21st century cathedral. It is a contemporary architectural gesture in the end, after all. And I think this is the thing that really sticks out for me in my mind. Joining those things together, all of these elements, and also treating the material that we have almost as a kind of scientific relic. As a medievalist, I see the way that we're sort of finding every single detail that has come out of the cathedral, every single timber, charred as it might have been, the way that we see that as precious is, as a medievalist, very inspiring. I see this as a kind of architectural relic, a secular relic that we sort of bring into the future to learn more from.
I think that's actually a wonderful ending point. But I do want, as a last thing, to ask if any of the panelists have questions burning, so I won't use that. Important questions for one another before we break. I wish, Benedict, that you had thought of this evening as the beginning of a weekend-long seminar, because it's not often that we assemble so many different facets that bring different perspectives, almost like a kaleidoscope of the same complex affair. But before we close the evening, and thank everyone for traveling to New York to talk about this monument that we like to think is as much ours as it is yours, for all you French people in the middle of the panel here. Do you have any questions while we're all together for one another? No? Okay, thank you.
I don't have questions, but I had some maybe new last things I wanted to say, because I wanted to first thank all the international donors, including the American donors, because without this support, nothing of what we've been talking about would have been possible. So I know some of you are here, so thanks a lot for that. It's much more than money, it's energy, it's faith in this reconstruction project that is so unique, and the talent of all these carpenters and artisans and workers on site. I've never seen such a unique project of restoration. For me, each time I visited the cathedral during the restoration, I was moved by this devotion of all the workers. It's really something specific to Notre-Dame. I've seen a lot of other restoration projects. This one is unique. And I just wanted to pay tribute also to General Jean-Louis Georgelin, who was the head of the restoration project. And unfortunately, he died in a hike last summer after a fall. And he will not see the end of the restoration. So I have this sad thought for him today, but he would be proud to see how it's moving forward and that we are on time. It was his obsession because it was the mission the president gave him. We have to be on time. 5 years is 5 years, not 6. So, and we will manage to reopen on December 8th. Of course, there will still be restoration works the year after and after, because until 2030, actually, we will need to do restoration works. Not only what was damaged by the fire, but also predated things that we plan to do. So you will still see scaffoldings and works around Notre-Dame for a few years, but it will reopen to the public, which we can't wait to see. Thank you all.
Excellent. Donc, rendez-vous le 8 décembre.
Thank you.